Hello everyone, my name is Corley Pretorius and I'm Deputy Director of the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, otherwise known as UNEP-WCMC. Welcome to today's session. Today we are launching the business brief, the GEO for Business brief, entitled Future-Proofing Infrastructure to Address the Climate, Biodiversity and Pollution Crises. UNEP has been undertaking these GEO, Global Environment Outlook processes since 1995. And this is part of our mandate to keep the global environment under review, to do the scientific analysis, bring together the scientific analysis to say what is happening to our environment and to raise the implications, awareness around the implications of these environmental trends. What we do with these analysis as part of the outreach and engagement is to develop audience-tailored products, such as the GEO for Business briefs, to help to engage the business community to understand how they need to understand and react to these environmental trends that's happening. And this is exactly today's session. What we are looking at is the interpretation and the implications for infrastructure around major environmental trends, what we call the crises, climate, pollution, and biodiversity crises. And we are looking at creating recommendations to really help businesses thrive under these circumstances and not just survive. So very pleased to invite you to this session today. We're going to have a discussion with our coordinating lead authors and other panelists around the business for brief around the infrastructure. But first, to open our session today, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Lydia Noronha to do the opening address for us. Lydia is Assistant Secretary General and the head of UNEP's New York office. Lydia, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carly, and good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the session. We're indeed delighted to have you here and to see so many of you joining us today for this session. The launch of today's GEO for Business is entitled Future-Proofing Infrastructure to Address the Climate, Biodiversity and Pollution Crises, comes at a very important moment. As you will see, future-proofing infrastructure is crucial for addressing the three planetary crises and achieving the SDGs, and you just heard Carly mentioning that. By future-proofing, I mean infrastructure that is flexible and resilient to risks, such as those posed by climate change and environmental disasters, such as flooding or fires. Future-proof infrastructure also helps us move towards a circular net zero carbon future. This is even more important now because between 1998 and 2017, climate-related disasters accounted for 91% of all recorded disasters, and this affected 2 billion people, mostly in Asia and Africa. More of these events are coming. The science is clear about this. Sea level is rising because of ocean warming and sea ice melt. This causes more flooding, which damages protective walls and affects coastal cities and small island states. Temperatures also rising, bringing more heat waves and dramatic weather changes, degrading or damaging infrastructure all around the world. Wildfires have been burning millions of hectares of forests and fields in every corner of the planet. All this impacts our homes, buildings, roads, and bridges that are needed for the well-being of people and nature. And it is not acceptable anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, we need to have infrastructure, or we see that infrastructure impacts the environment. The infrastructure sector, in fact, is responsible for about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That is why we need change. And this means investments in low carbon resilient infrastructure. And this will only happen if there is a collaboration between the public and private sector, businesses and governments. We need to move away from what we call gray infrastructure that encourages more use of fossil fuels and produces more greenhouse gas emissions, as well as fragmenting biodiversity. Nature positive, blue and green infrastructure instead can benefit businesses, both public and private. It can do so by reducing risks, lowering costs, producing fewer stranded assets, and opening new market opportunities, including new jobs. This brief is here to guide businesses in this direction, in a direction that is meant to tackle the three crises but also be profitable for businesses so that these actions can be taken up at a larger scale globally. Because a stable climate and a healthy natural world are very crucial for human well-being. Business success depends on healthy people, on resilient societies and productive natural systems. Right now, every single one of these is under threat. The scale of the challenge is not small, as we all know, but we have the tools to join the right path. That's why I'm happy to see you here today. Business is a critical partner in designing and building environmental, sustainable, inclusive, and just infrastructure. Everyone is needed in this collaborative effort, and this effort will help transform the world. There's tremendous opportunity for those who take up the challenge, who dare to explore, to experiment, and to collaborate. But, and I want to be very clear here, for businesses who fail to transform, peril lies ahead. Companies that fail to adapt and will find it impossible to attract investments, talent, and customers. In short, business as usual is one-way road to irrelevance. So what can businesses do? Firstly, they can consider the multiple benefits of incorporating nature-based solutions in their business models. Secondly, they can decarbonize and detoxify energy systems by considering renewable energy in new and existing infrastructure design. Thirdly, they can prioritize smart mobility and expand zero-emission vehicle infrastructure. Fourthly, they can focus on integrating water resources efficiency in the design of infrastructure, as well as designing infrastructure to support a circular economy. Finally, they can involve all stakeholders at all stages of design and planning. This is crucial to ensure socially inclusive and nature-positive infrastructure systems. Most of these steps are not complicated and all come with a compelling business case. $90 trillion are expected to be invested in key infrastructure by 2030. Let this investment be towards low-carbon resilient infrastructure that moves us towards reducing emissions and achieving net zero carbon by 2050. I hope all of us here today can work together to drive the change we so desperately need. Thank you and all the very best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you for those messages and for underlying the urgency, but also the rationale and the real opportunities for adopting more sustainable infrastructure practices, blue-green infrastructure as we refer them, and really consider those lock-ins that the decisions around infrastructure can create for many societies, especially in the context of climate change. Thank you very much for those messages. I see that my colleagues have posted the link to the document in the chat, and I would like to also invite you, of course, to put your questions and comments and other resources, really, if you would like to share other resources in the chat as well. But let me now turn to my panel and introduce the panel to pick up on this discussion and really talk around some of the how-to maybe, and not so much the why. So if I can introduce them, first is Ifeoma Malu, who is the CEO of Clean Technology Hub, Energy Innovation Center, and former country campaign director for Power for All in Nigeria. Then happy to introduce Chris Manjuri, who works on project development and investment due diligence at Full Cycle Climate Partners, a growth equity fund. Chris is also coordinating lead author of the GEO 6 Infrastructure Business Brief. Graham Ponton is Head of Economic and Strategic Policy at the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, a very important stakeholder group for our discussion today. And finally, welcome to Jessica Thorne, who is also a coordinating lead author of this business brief we're launching today. And Jessica is a research associate at the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York, among other positions. Very welcome to the panel. So Ifeoma, if I can start with you, I want to ask a little bit about innovation. This is really your area of work. And we know that it's not always obvious to how we can accelerate innovation around infrastructure. In fact, there are sometimes barriers or processes that hinder innovation. Can you tell us more what innovation means for future-proofing infrastructure?
Thank you so much for that question. Can everybody hear me?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think the important thing to note when we talk about innovation and juxtaposing it with climate resilience is to understand that when we're looking at large-scale development, especially for the third world or developing countries, we have to look at, providing people-centered infrastructure and that are built with nature in mind and not against nature, and are built in a sustainable and circular manner. And what do I mean by that? It means that we have to co-create with the communities that we're trying to develop. That's a model that we have to talk about and look at it from an inclusive innovation point of view. And what that means is that we have to also look for nature-based solutions to infrastructure while we're applying a cost-benefit analysis that is holistic. So when we're doing construction, for instance, whether it's for houses or roads, one of the things we usually ask at Clean Tech Hub is, what is the least damage costs rather than what is the least financial costs? And I think these are some of the questions that helps us get into whether we're building a sustainable, innovative infrastructure, or whether it's just very financial and cost-driven. The other thing that we also want to know is, how is the community developing along with this infrastructure? Because in Nigeria, for instance, we've had decades of problems with large multinationals coming in to take natural resources and not taking into account the communities that they're working in. And this has caused serious tensions in the past. So today, we're at the stage where we're asking anybody, whether it's a local developer or an international developer, what are your plans for the people in the communities that you're planning to build this infrastructure? How are they going to be a part of it? What is going to be their gain? These are hard questions. And if they're not part of the plan, whether it's the feasibility plan or the environmental impact plan, then it's not something that we generally support. And I think these are some of the things that we have to talk about more broadly when we're talking about innovation in people-centered infrastructure.
Thank you very much. And I find that a very interesting perspective, because it's really innovation in the norms and institutions that we've had up until now, really in thinking about infrastructure. So it's not only on the technology side, but it's also the types of performance indicators around infrastructure. It's a type of policy processes. It's a type of financing that's available. So Absolutely. It's really a combination of creating more fit for purpose, if you like, norms and institutions around that. So maybe if I can move to Chris, because you are exactly working on accelerating the adoption or the use, the uptake of some of these technologies, in fact, but through innovative approaches. And one of the things that I understand that's coming up in your work is also the relevance of interdependencies and cross-sectoral partnerships. And maybe this is one of the institutional arrangements that are also changing. How are you experiencing their role in terms of both pace, but also scale of uptake?
Great question, Corley. So cross-sectoral partnerships, both between different private industries and between public and private sector, is key, as we all know, and it's critical to accelerating the deployment of sustainable circular infrastructure. So I'll give you an example. In the US, there's been a huge surge in capital deployed to renewable natural gas projects specifically. In part, this is due to lucrative subsidies provided by the California and the West Coast markets, but it's also in part due to demand from big publicly traded utilities such as NextEra, PG&E, SoCalGas, these big names that everybody knows, who want to really decarbonize their portfolio, but they don't have the means to do it internally. So for example, SoCalGas is trying to replace 20% of their traditional natural gas with RNG by 2030, but they don't have the means to develop enough projects to do that. Therefore, they put out requests for project development. So essentially, they're offering these long-term fixed contracts for a developer to go in and build an RNG plant, whether it be new gasification projects or anaerobic digestion. But with that long-term fixed offtake, the developer is then able to secure capital to build the project because it de-risks the project and enables a financier like us to underwrite such project. which then accelerates that growth, especially for newer technologies that aren't really wide scale. Anaerobic digestion is growing, gasification, it's becoming more widespread, but that underwriting and that de-risking of the projects is key in order to accelerate the growth.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I would assume that the more of these microcosms or patterns, the connections, the dots in the landscape that you can create, the easier it is to also to scale and to create a systems approach. So you need really the first takers to move, first movers to take up on these opportunities.
Absolutely. Once the pathways have been established, then it's much easier for subsequent developers to come in and build the projects. But it's really those first pioneers that are paving the way for the rest of the sector.
Great, thank you. Graham, in Lydia's remarks, she spoke about lock-ins, and this is something that many of us appreciate, that if you take that infrastructure investment decision, that you might have it for, or it's intended to live for 50 or 60 or 70 years. How can the engineering community help us to shift the needle, to think about resilience when we build these very long-term intergenerational really infrastructure projects?
Thank you. I mean, I'd like to say, first of all, the report is interesting, and I'd encourage people to read it. I mean, for me, before I sort of answer the question, I'd say there's three key takeaways that will sort of follow through on how I respond. One is the link between the environment and infrastructure and vice versa. The second is the need to move away from business as usual, or the traditional approach, depending upon the terminology you want to use, and the risks both in terms of inaction, but also actively mitigating some of the issues that are still going to occur because of locked-in carbon that already exists. So putting that in the light of the fact that we've now got less than 3,000 days to deliver the SDGs, we've obviously got a significant task at hand. So if we look at grey infrastructure, I mean, the first thing I'd say is it's important to look at not only the development of new infrastructure, but also the refurbishment and how we reuse infrastructure that currently exists and more efficiently and sustainably. So for this, we're going to need the whole sector to work together in its approaches. So it's not just one party that's going to deliver this. This shift to work together needs to happen across the whole range of activities, from the very first exploration of projects, solutions and ideas, through policy making, finance, procurement, design, construction, completion and operation, which is sometimes forgotten, and decommissioning as well. Now, engineers, as you asked the specific question, we play an important and vital role in the design of these projects and how they effectively lock in, as you say, carbon. So the upfront part and actually being involved in the decision making and the innovation at the start costs significantly less than the project as a whole if you add it all up. So actually putting in the investment at the start and actually helping to develop the solutions of the future that are more sustainable and use sort of things like natural diversity and biodiversity is quite important. So if we look at those sort of in bits and pieces, we need to be in early decision making. We have to become part of financing as well, because actually the finance sector needs to evolve to not have sustainability as part of a finance package. Actually, it's got to become part of day-to-day financing for companies, for infrastructure, and more widely. We can't simply go back to business as usual. Business as usual will only repeat what we're doing today for tomorrow. And the goals that we've got on the SDGs are quite a significant thing that we've got to meet. Procurement processes and contracts will need to evolve. So procurement processes will need to involve more sustainability. And you mentioned in the report several ways of working, from tendering and alliancing and cooperation. And all of these sort of structures will have to use to their best. Contracts also play their role. As you know, FEDEX is involved in contracts. And these will also need to evolve over time to have more sustainability clauses and things like that in. Construction techniques will also need to change because there is a large chunk of carbon that actually happens in the building of projects and in the refurbishment of projects. So that's going to have to improve going forward. And this all comes down to connecting better across the infrastructure sector, and then also working out how we decommission or reuse assets. You talk in the report a bit about stranded assets. ideally, in an ideal world, you don't want stranded assets. It's unutilized resource, which is economically inefficient. And then I'd say the last part of that is if we really want change to occur, we need to turn around and change the culture and education and actually shift towards this sort of way of thinking. And that also involves bringing in clients and the public. If the public actually are in the discussion and they actively want, and the end users want to turn around and undertake sustainable solutions, the drive for clients and governments will be much more accelerated than it would otherwise be. And I think given that we've got the timeline of 2030 and the prospect of net zero after, and the fact that marginal gains will become more difficult, we're going to have to bring everybody along on side.
Wonderful. Thank you, Graham. And thank you for that perfect segue to Jessica's question around multi-stakeholder and participatory processes. I'll get to that in a moment. Thank you also for calculating the days to deliver the SDGs. I suppose someone had to do it on the panel to keep us on our toes. I think the point around both reducing impact, but also looking at dependencies of infrastructure on functioning ecosystems, as in climate resilience, resilience to degrading ecosystems, and through the decommissioning opportunities for restoration, regeneration, are all incredibly important considerations that we can bring into this decision making. So thank you for raising those points. To Jessica, on multi-stakeholder and participatory processes, how important are they in the development of resilient, future-proof infrastructure? And what are the actions that businesses can take in this regard?
Thank you, Corley. And I certainly agree it's a perfect segue into this question. I mean, the recent pandemic has really highlighted the need for infrastructure to provide services to all sectors of society, particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups. And it can really help avoid leading to unintended consequences, such as green gentrification or the displacement of people living in poverty or in informal settlements. And I think that this brief, we've really tried to build the case that both the public and the private sector need to work on socially inclusive, transparent, and people-centered infrastructure design. We also need to accelerate this transition, this just transition, where businesses can work with local communities, has been aforementioned, to co-manage infrastructure at all stages of the assets. But especially in planning and design, through processes like stakeholder analysis and public participation processes. So it's not just about momentary, but rather ongoing, effective and inclusive engagement that can not only boost the morale and reputation of a company, but it can also build trust and stimulate creative thinking, as well as secure potential grievance mechanisms. So we talked about 10 key approaches that we thought have been shown to work. One is that successful infrastructure design and implementation must involve these multi-stakeholder processes, consultative processes. So this helps to identify priorities and bring investment decisions closer to the end user. The second approach is about applying these adaptive governance and co-management based on the local context. So clearly no business operates in a vacuum, and the private sector must work with government to identify what works and what doesn't, and what are the most efficient methods. So for example, stakeholders such as institutional investors or banks must not only provide low-cost financing facilities or instruments where the suggested public finance route is not possible at scale, but business also has an important role in strengthening these institutions, as has been mentioned earlier, for greater regional and international coordination. Another element is that it must apply these community-based design approaches that go beyond simply providing a service or meeting a need to ensuring that participation is involved in the implementation. So this can support people with different social classes or poverty levels or governance, and accounts for the long-term established understanding of risk that many Indigenous communities have responded to for a long period of time, and can lead to cost savings. We also talked about the importance of cultural norms that need to be understood prior to designing infrastructure developments, and ensuring that we avoid these adverse ramifications, for example, cultural diffusion or violence associated with xenophobia during construction. We talked about the need for hiring locally, where employees can anticipate the impact on local communities and their choice of staff, and mitigate trade-offs such as gentrification or driving up costs or competing skill sets. And we also talked about the need for creating local employment during construction, but also other phases where the businesses can gain support. There's a need to generate quality green jobs that supports all levels of enterprise, training marginalized groups, honing technical or entrepreneurial skills, and applying a gender-sensitive approach where businesses can understand the gendered roles in managing a project and how project developers can ensure that systems are designed to meet different service needs or prevent adverse outcomes on different genders. Removing language barriers that can lead to potential conflicts, for example, through obtaining a level of certification for language or providing bilingual trainers, as well as aligning infrastructure to health outcomes with infrastructure delivery. For example, conducting baseline studies of what is the health assets that are needed in a given community. And finally, of course, tools that are participatory rural appraisal tools can be very useful for designing and integrating different types of knowledges. So clearly there's not one single approach, but no one must be left behind.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And thank you also for pointing out that while there are definitely peaks in these processes, whether it's around planning or the construction phase or decommissioning phase, it is of course a continuous stream also of benefits and or costs in terms of the operation derived from the operations of many of these infrastructure facilities. So that's also something that we need to take into consideration. And maybe that question then to Ifeoma in terms of the positive aspects. So if we turn the narrative around and really look at what are the positive aspects of adopting climate-proof approaches in infrastructure or nature-positive strategies. Oops, you're on mute. Probably a double mute somewhere.
Sorry about that. So the simple answer is that there are huge cost savings in projects and operational costs when we adopt, climate-proof and nature-positive infrastructure or infrastructure models. We see that the commercial viability for those projects are a lot more sustainable. There's reduced energy savings. There's increased investments to scale smart energy infrastructure. And there's also tangible, impacts for communities. I like some of the lists that Jessica mentioned as she was giving her response, because communities actually, for us to talk about climate resilience and sustainability, communities have to be placed at the center of that. And it also goes to some of the answers that I heard from Chris and from Graham around how we build a circularity into infrastructure and reduce waste. And I think these are important to note because, when we're using things like green roofs, biodegradable materials, like plastics to make blocks rather than cement, which is what we popularly use in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in West Africa, and allowing more sunlight into homes and, to reduce the electricity consumptions. I think these are some of the practical things that we know and we're seeing, at least, that can help building climate-proof infrastructure. I'll tell you something else that I've seen happening across West Africa. We've gone from a construction model that emphasized single home ownership, a man, wife, kids in their own gated communities, to us having condos, a lot of condominiums and gated communities where there's shared infrastructure and things like shared security. And this is actually driving a lot of, some of the reduction that we're seeing in carbon emissions when we have people who calculate those things for us. Because just the mere fact that people are not building, humongous mansions and are building, very compact homes is a driver in terms of the decision-making around where our home infrastructure, home ownership is going. And I think that some of these things are also based on data in terms of what's more cost-effective for people and for the future. One last point I'll make before I hand it over back to you is the data is also showing that the next generation isn't quite interested in some of the things that our parents or our generation are interested in. And there's that mindset shift. I mean, I work in my hub, we're about 40 people, and the average age of the staff at the hub is 28 years old. They're not looking to own mansions. They're not, they're all talking about sustainability. They're talking about having electric cars. And so some of that mindset shift that we see occurring is coming from the generation after us. And it's completely transforming our consumption patterns as parents and as even the people who have the wherewithal to make those changes. And when you get that sense that, trying to leave real estate, multiple real estates for your kids isn't going to be of concern to them because they're much more interested in other things and maybe not even interested in living in the cities that you live in. It helps with some of the investment decisions that you're making down the line. And so it's having that systemic view in terms of how to close the gaps to reduce pollution and how to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is carrying the most important and the most vulnerable people along the line. And so that's my answer. One of the last things I'll say is it's also a way to create clean jobs. When we're talking about a post-COP26 conference, one of the big things that is coming out from some of the West African meetings we're seeing is how do we create clean jobs? Because, the jobs of the future are not going to be the jobs that we have today. So what are those things? And if construction is a big driver for employment, especially in West Africa, because of our stage of development, then these are some of the things that we also have to begin to look at from an employment perspective. And the data is telling us a lot.
Thank you very much. And then if you look at it in this sort of a systems or systemic way, where do you bring these sort of innovations together? Because they are, as you pointed out, around houses to housing or accommodation, but there are also questions around, instead of vehicles, looking at mobility and innovations around transport. Is that the government's responsibility, or how do we bring this bigger picture, the systems changes about?
I think it's both private sector and public sector. One of the voices that we also need to actively bring into the room is civil society and community leaders. I think these are people that we have to work closely together with. A lot of the developments that we're seeing in construction is very private sector driven. Very rapidly, we're seeing governments also because the government has decided, the Nigerian government at least for some time decided to take its hand off a lot of large infrastructure development. And there's a PPP arrangement they get into if it's something that needs significant investments. But I think having, civil society and community leaders are people that we need to have on the table. The other thing I think that is critical, and I think Jessica mentioned it during her statement, was we actually need to rethink some of the policies, especially I can speak for the ones in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the model around the policy making and regulations are centered around, constructions the way they've been in the past. And it's time that we have to get the government to begin to look at, climate resilience construction as a way to begin to drive investments and the money into those developments. Until we do that, people are going to shy away from bringing big money into a place where they think it's the old methods that are being used to drive new business operations or models.
Thank you very much. And of course, financing and the requirements or the demands that finance can bring into this conversation, or the financial sector more broadly, or more correctly, can bring into this discussion is really, really important. So maybe if Chris can use approaches around biodiversity net gain as a way where we can also bring in a different approach or different performance metrics into the discussion, different expectations of what these infrastructure projects should deliver.
Absolutely. Piggybacking off of that, and also what Graham said before, it's important to look at these projects not just in pure financial metrics, but also building new performance metrics around that. We've actually developed one for climate. So it's called the Carbon Return on Investment, or CROI 20, because we look at investments based on a GWP 20-year horizon as opposed to 100. So focusing on short-lived climate pollutants, methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, but seeing what the carbon return for the capital spent on that project is. So we're able to prioritize, if we have, say, $50 million to spend on a project, which project should we build first that's going to pull on that climate lever more so to really drive down impact.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Moving on to Graham, on the standards and the benchmarks, and how do we get the sort of how do we get these standards and benchmarks and approaches to be more than just checking the box? So are there ways where we can give real meaning and real purpose to safeguards, environmental and social safeguards? And I think for a very long time, we've worked around the sort of a minimize harm or do no harm approach, but they are, in the current context and in the framing of the brief, certainly great opportunities for do good. So it doesn't always need to be by just minimizing cost or minimizing harm, but turning the thinking around in terms of achieving better outcomes, positive outcomes also for nature and people.
I mean, yes, I mean, I'd say there's a number of standards that exist out there with regards to infrastructure sustainability. Obviously, if you go down the multilateral development bank type route, they generally have ones that you have to adhere to if you're taking financing for projects. Less so when you move into some parts of government and private projects, but slowly these standards are continuing to evolve, and they do exist to be there. I mean, what I'd say is, given the discussion the panel's had, is first of all, local approaches are important, and local communities do like to develop their own standards. And obviously, if you're trying to build infrastructure in an environment where you're trying to take into account the sustainability in the community, you have to have a certain extent of the local sort of features and biodiversity there, because that's the environment in which it works. But by the same means, I would also say that harmonization is important, because there are things that are applicable across multiple local environments and even globally, where a harmonization of approach and actually sharing best practice means that it's far more efficient to actually learn from each other and develop these projects. And with the time we have, we need to use it as wisely as possible. I mean, within that, one thing I'd say is data is very important. If we're not measuring it and we actually can't tell how it's performing or whether it's meeting what we expected it to, we can't change our approach to make sure that we're doing better tomorrow. So data is going to become increasingly important, not only on the building a new infrastructure, but the monitoring of existing infrastructure and also how we use infrastructure. We'll then move into territories such as intelligent decision making, where potentially you could bring things like artificial intelligence into aiding the decisions of how you build infrastructure or where you should build infrastructure, whether one community or another community, because that sort of artificial intelligence needs to be based on expertise and obviously information that's credible. And importantly, I think these standards and approaches, they have to continue to develop over time. The standards that we have today may not be the standards that we need in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, especially as we pass the SDGs and head to net zero. The marginal gains are going to become more difficult to attain. And so the standards are going to have to move probably more often towards the latter period than they will at the current period. So I think there is a challenge there for the whole sector, and it's something that we do have to turn around and keep up with. But we have to try and keep some degree of knowledge sharing and harmonization. I mean, it goes back to the education, skills and culture point, because if we lose that, we effectively are all operating in silos, and we're not actually going down the circular sort of economy, working together sustainability route. We're actually going in the opposite direction.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And what is the role of the Federation in that you can play in that? Because I mean, I like to call it new approaches, because I think these approaches have been applied and they are implemented in many places, but it's really a question of scale and accelerating and creating critical mass and adopting these approaches on the one hand, and really phasing out practices that are maybe not so great for our collective future. So, you know, they are harmful practices that needs to be phased out. And I very much appreciate the challenge around skills, because I think this is an important one for all of our institutions. When we convert to or adopt new approaches, it's really bringing the entire organization or the sector along in to be able to implement it. I think you have a very good point actually on standards, that maybe your leverage or your trigger is this sort of future looking incremental change through standards that are just the stepping stones to create, to scale it. But from the Federation's point of view, how do you advertise and mobilize around some of these approaches?
So, I mean, obviously, I mean, from FEDEX point of view, we have around 100 member associations which work in countries all around the globe. So they will all have programs to encourage future leaders to come forward, and they'll have training exercises. They also have their own activities with regards to national policy and local policy. The Federation FEDEX then pulls together this expertise, and through our various committees, capacity building mechanisms, certification programs we do, the aim is to share global best practice across these federations. That also includes sharing information and actually just knowledge of what's going on. For example, the awards we do with projects try to show best in class and demonstrate actually where innovation is taking place and these sorts of approaches, because it is important, and the skills bit especially is important.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Jessica for a question around scenario planning, but just a sort of a early warning to all the panelists that after that, maybe we can go to a sort of a final comments and a closing round for closing statements. But Jessica, on scenario planning, and I just actually in the last week or so read about a process for the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor in Tanzania, where you did some fantastic scenario planning with the engagement of communities. And I think it sets out such a clear vision in terms of potential futures. And maybe this is also something that we need to use much more to visualize what are the outcomes and what are the pathways that we are looking at. But how are you sort of promoting these, and how do you find how easy it is for people to engage in the scenario planning exercises?
Yes, I think strategic foresight or scenario planning is one type of tool that one can use for identifying or mitigating or avoiding potential risks, but also trying to improve coordination and understanding different types of visions and different types of stakeholders, understanding about the future and where they would like to avoid certain trade-offs. So, for example, beginning an infrastructure investment with scenario planning, we believe in this case can help prepare for a range of different futures, including the extent of exposure to certain types of risks, physical risks from direct impacts, for example, property damage, or it can eliminate indirect losses like for foregone economic activity from a disruption. It also can eliminate legal implications, for instance, if climate risk disruption means that companies can't deliver against their contracts. But it also allows businesses to evaluate particular regions which are most critical in terms of where they should get their materials from, what equipment they should be using, what are the products and suppliers. And it can help plan, design, build, and operate new assets to account for climate change over their lifespan. So scenarios can also test corporate risk management and governance systems to ensure that it's robust enough to be able to deal with early warnings or of any potential cost, time, or contractual issues. And as Graham was saying earlier, we really need to we believe this is a useful tool in terms of contingency planning and monitoring. So for instance, if you have you might have some environmental impact assessments, but we realize that often these EIAs and these industry standards they can be enablers, but they're not regularly employed. And we believe that tools like scenario planning combined with robust quality EIAs or strategic environmental social impact assessments can also build corporate responsibility and support communities in defining and actualizing these visions of the future. And I think just finally, I think it's really important as one tool of many that it can help show the extent of how infrastructure connects multiple SDGs or supports the delivery of these multiple SDGs. So and also avoid impacts. For example, if you're building a hospital in a place where there's a wildlife corridor and there's surrounding communities that depend on the landscape, scenario planning can help illuminate these trade-offs and before they arise.
Both in terms of sort of understanding potential pathways or potential scenarios, but also as multi-stakeholder processes. I think they're great really to have that conversation in a multi-stakeholder context or multi-sector context, because we have shared pathways. You know, none of these infrastructure projects are really developed and operate in isolation. And I think this is why it's such a fantastic planning tool and engagement tool to bring conversations together around the future of infrastructure.
Absolutely. And if anyone's interested in the future scenario that you described, we're going to be launching it in a few weeks' time with WCMC.
I see Amaya has already posted it in the chat. Thank you, Amaya. But it will be launched soon. But yeah, the link is available, and I will encourage people to please have a look at that. It's really an interesting example of how many different pathways and perspectives there are about the future around, in this case, the Kilimanjaro Valley in Tanzania. We are nearing the end of this discussion. We have still a little bit of time left, so not too dramatic. So maybe last round of comments and perspectives, starting with Ifeoma again, please.
Okay, so I think I want to bring in the gender dimension into infrastructure policies and how we can include women's perspectives in some of the decision making around cleaner infrastructure and climate-friendly infrastructure. I think the first place to start is to say that, well-designed infrastructure and resource management can meet gender needs, and that it's important to know that infrastructural development can address gender disparities. And what do I mean by this? I'll tell you a very short story. When we bought our first home, or when we wanted to buy our first home, we eventually ended up buying that home. It was in a gated community as usual. And we had gone on inspection. We had bought it off plan, meaning that it hadn't been fully built. And so we could buy it at a lower cost while the developer uses that money to build out other parts of the infrastructure. When it was completed, I was really shocked at the size of the kitchen. It was very small. We had a very large sitting room for whatever reason, and very small dining room and very small kitchen. That property, that development stayed on the market for about 7 years before they could sell off every unit in it. And that's unusual because usually in Nigeria, within a year, those sort of developments are sold off. So the developer lost money. The investors in that development lost money. And at the end of the day, they had to sell a lot of the remaining houses at a discount. And I was explaining to the developer, I remember having a conversation with him where I asked him if there were any women on his team. And he said, no. I said, well, that's your problem, because if you had women on the team, they'll tell you that, family happens in the kitchen and on the dining table, not in front of the living room with a big, big screen. I love to stay on the dining table to do homework with my kids. My kids are always walking in and out of the kitchen to grab an apple or grab something to eat. So that's where a lot of the bonding takes place. It's around the meal where we all cook together. And if you had asked any woman, they would have asked you to make the kitchen a lot bigger rather than making it, like a matchbox, because it's very uncomfortable to be in the kitchen. And I told them a lot of wives probably told their husbands that they didn't want to live there. This was news to him, but it wasn't surprising, that it took them 7 years to sell off all of that property at a loss. So it's important that when we're building out any infrastructure, that we understand women's perspective and needs, that we also have, institutional commitments and policies that includes women, and even, a much more diverse policy that includes everybody. But also it's important to note that including women across the value chain, from infrastructure design to implementation and maintenance, will get you good returns. I'm sure the economists and the financial experts would agree with me. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And thank you for raising that perspective. It is indeed incredibly important. And it comes through in all infrastructure applications, walks of life, whether it's around mobility, whether location of schools, location of hospitals. Woman needs to be part of the decision-making and the solution and the shaping, the design of these projects, because that is part of how life works, really. So thank you very much, Ifeoma, for raising that. Chris, final perspectives, remarks from your side.
Yes, absolutely. So over the next decade, this is an incredible investment opportunity globally, every single nation. Trillions of dollars will need to be spent every single year to convert our infrastructure over. And we still have a long way to go. So in the automobile sector, I think Tesla sold the most EVs last year, around 400,000, but you still have Toyota selling 10 million internal combustion vehicles every year. And the electric vehicle sector is one of the most progressive industries to date, right? Utilities, electric vehicles, we still have to change over every single plane, train, long-haul trucking, long-haul shipping. Those technologies haven't even been really proven at scale yet at cost parity with fossil fuels. So I would just say I'm so excited about the next decade because there is so much investment opportunity and innovation and opportunity for youth and young people to get into new careers, into burgeoning industries that haven't even been created yet, but that will transform our entire global economy.
Wonderful, fantastically positive and optimistic note. And yes, indeed, a massive opportunity. Graham, closing remarks.
Perspectives. Sort of following on from Chris, I think one of the most important things is that actually we connect the investors, because there is money out there to be spent and there are opportunities, but actually get it through the environment between private and public policy to actually on the ground with the engineers and the people who are going to actually undertake these projects and actually undertake the refurbishments and things for the next 10 years. If you think of it in light of COVID, we had action to turn around and deal with COVID, and we've had 2 years of it. We need that for a decade or two to achieve what we're doing here. So it sort of puts light in the scale of it, but we actually need to start having more action on sort of up the front and actually getting a project pipeline going forward, because if the pipeline doesn't exist, it will all stall and we'll be talking about the same situation in 3 years' time.
Perfect. Decade of action. Fantastic. Jessica.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to express my sincere thanks to everybody who's been involved, of course, before I mentioned on the closing statement, just because it's been so much hard work that's gone into it, and especially from our co-authors, Professor Dan Olago and Maria Buchigas and Julia Baker and Tio Septioni and the UNEP team and all the advisory boards. So I'm sure that's going to be mentioned, but thank you. Personal thanks to everybody for their hard work. And we hope that you will look at this brief. There's a lot of different areas that we've tried to be quite specific and provide practical approaches in terms of integrated water management, from industrial symbiosis, built environment work, nature-based solutions, transit-orientated solutions, looking at compact cities and repairing retrofitting and circularity. So we really hope that you find this a useful tool. And if there's only one point that I hope that you take home is that constructing integrated infrastructure optimizes systemic interdependencies and cross-sectoral partnerships. And integrated planning is really critical, and thinking about systems of systems and considering the interconnections across sectors. So if we build in these built-in redundancies and flexibility, we can allow infrastructure to operate when it's stressed, and it has greater fiscal, institutional, and technical capacity to respond to and adjust to different types of changes and future pathways. It also allows for more flexibility across space, time, and optionality. So that's my last points. Thank you.
Fantastic. It is a great point to end with, because we have the opportunity. There are multiple avenues for combining forces, for collaboration, for cooperation around that. The tools are out there, and it is really as a collective for us to move forward and to create the institutions and the norms or the standards, the processes that can help us to build this resilience into our infrastructure, into our daily lives. So thank you very much for ending on such a positive note. Thank you very much, first of all, to the panelists, and also to the authors, the leading authors and the other contributors to this business brief. It's a really positive, forward-looking, opportunity-filled briefing note that we're launching today. Thank you to my colleagues in UNEP also for making sure that we can deliver that. And a big thank you to the tech support that we've had on this event, also for seamless support. So with that, I'll send you off with a few minutes to go. So this is the magic 5 minutes break between meetings that we don't always get. But thank you for the positive engagement, and we'll make sure that we release and share the documents and the other resources that were posted also in the chat today. Many thanks, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.